T minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And liftoff of the Atlas V rocket with tdrs-k, broadening, enhancing, and improving the capability of space-based tracking.
Mankind has long been exploring the unknown world, whether on Earth or beyond. We wonder, with insatiable curiosity, about the universe in relation to our existence, from the realm of the smallest to the largest. But more importantly, we discover, in order to make sense of the unknown factors of the universe through our innate cognitive power, and overthrow the invalidated worldview to form a new one, despite the popular reluctance to change and the likely political assaults against the new vision of the world for the sake of preserving the old order.
We should attempt a return to the surface of the moon first, as previously planned. But I just have to say, pretty bluntly here, we've been there before.
The decision that was made by the International Monetary Fund on February 1st, 2013, to issue an official censure to the nation of Argentina and threatening it for sanction is a clear sign that the authorities in the present system will continue with their policies with absolute commitment, despite the fact that their decisions will assure the destruction of the human civilizations all over the planet. However, there are emerging alternatives to the present paradigm. The recent successful launch of NASA's tdrs-k satellite, highly advanced communication satellite, or the groundbreaking Mars Science Lab, also known as Curiosity, is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, in terms of the whole series of potential scientific breakthroughs that could transform entirely the way in which we organize ourselves and our civilizations in the very near future. We are at a crossroads where the great prospect for the future development of mankind is overshadowed by the immediate breakdown of the entire global economic system, which not only will hinder the ongoing scientific progress, but can cripple the very potential that exists today in order to deal with the urgent galactic threats, which are more real today than any other period in the history of mankind. We have come to the point in history where the economic crisis is visible virtually everywhere in the world, from the continent of Europe, the North and the Sub-Saharan regions of Africa, to the Americas. The type of crisis that we are living today is not regional or temporary by nature. If we do not shift away from our conventional approach to the reality of the global situation, this crisis will soon become a trigger for an irreversible chain reaction collapse of our economic foundations, which will most likely lead to the general warfare with thermonuclear weapons. However, those who claim the position of influence in the world have been adamant that the solution is to stay the course and not change the foundation of the present global economic system. In fact, we have been faithfully following the prescription given by the world's elites and the prestigious institutions such as the IMF for decades. Yet, there is not a slightest indication of any recovery to speak of. Perhaps the best example for the analysis of the present global crisis may be the historical struggle of the Republic of Argentina for its economic sovereignty and social justice without relying on the international financier interests. The relationship between Argentina and the IMF is an illustrative case in this context. The International Monetary Fund was created on July 22, 1944, at the famous Bretton Woods Conference, which came into existence on December 27, 1945. This period marked the beginning of the tragic downturn for the world at large. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected for the first time in 1932, not because of the war, since the United States then was maintaining its tradition of anti-imperialist, non-interventionist policies, but because of the Great Depression. He became the only American president in history who served 4 terms until his death on April 12, 1945, only 4 months before the end of the World War II. He was the single most important figure in order to realize the vision of the post-war period without colonialism anywhere in the world. The IMF, along with the newly founded United Nations, was seen as a useful tool to achieve this end. However, the untimely death of President Roosevelt left a vacuum in the world leadership through which the British Empire, represented by a pure imperialist Winston Churchill, successfully perverted the future vision of FDR into something that would serve its own sinister interests. The 2 nuclear bombs were dropped in the middle of the civilian centers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Truman administration under the auspices of the British Empire, which paved the way for the opening of another world war that came to be known as the Cold War. Under this new imperial scheme, the institutions such as the IMF have lost the core of their identity to serve the humanity and to become absorbed in the British orchestrated Cold War structure of the world. In the meanwhile, the nation of Argentina was going through its own paradigm shift with the emergence of Juan Domingo Perón. Immensely popular among the laborers and the forgotten layers of the population, Perón was elected as the President of the Republic of Argentina on February 24, 1946, about 2 weeks prior to the so-called Iron Curtain speech given by Winston Churchill at Westminster College in Missouri, the home state of President Truman, in order to convince the United States to break from the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt on the question of the world without colonialism, and rather to join the British Empire's war on communist world.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line...
Despite the artificial geopolitical division drawn by the British Empire between the capitalist and the communist regions of the world, Argentina under Perón squarely refused to play the same imperial game. For instance, he quickly nationalized the Central Bank of Argentina and paid off its billion-dollar debt to the Bank of England. This was not necessarily a surprising move, not simply because of his stated commitment to the economic sovereignty, but also because of the historical experience of Argentina with the colonial interventionist policies of the British Empire. The Panic of 1890, or the Bering Crisis, is the 19th century's most famous sovereign debt crisis caused by the near insolvency of Barings Bank in London due to excessive risk-taking on poor investments in Argentina. It barely averted the complete collapse of the entire private banking system of London and potentially the entire region of Europe through an international consortium assembled by the governor of the Bank of England, which included the Rothschilds and most of the major London banks of the time. However, Argentina, along with the neighboring countries such as Brazil and Uruguay, was devastated by this massive collapse of international speculative bubble and was left with a permanent scar in the memory of all the Argentines. Aiming to achieve the economic sovereignty, Perón nationalized many of the key economic sectors of Argentina, such as the railways, which were mostly owned by British and French companies, universities, public utilities, public transport, and so on. Regarding the foreign policy, he adopted the concept La Tercera Posición, or the third position, in order to clarify the Argentine stance that it would not partake in either side of the Cold War division for the sake of their ideologies, a stance which became a precedent of the non-aligned movement. Argentina was headed toward its economic sovereignty without submitting to foreign financier interests known commonly today as voucher funds. Argentina joined the IMF on September 20, 1956, only after the bloody coup d'etat of 1955 through which Perón narrowly escaped the aerial bombings of the heart of Buenos Aires and was forced into exile in Spain. Since then, the entire nation has fallen into a state of disarray for the decades to follow, including a series of dictatorships which culminated in 1976, when the bloodiest regime in the Argentine history was established through a coup and ouster of the President Isabel Perón, wife of the deceased former President Juan Perón. Even after the restoration of democracy in 1983, the nation had to endure the period of neoliberalism through radical privatization policies, allowing an enormous influx of foreign investments and speculations, and the massive borrowing by the government from the international financial institutions such as IMF. The real recovery had to wait for the arrival of Nestor Kirchner and his wife and incumbent president, Cristina Fernandez. Take a look at the world today. Even after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent closing of the Cold War era, many nations are still struggling to find out the true meaning of the national sovereignty, and the great majority of them are, perhaps unwillingly, going along with the trend of the day, namely the globalization based on the classic ideology of the British Empire. In other words, man is not anything more than a pleasure-seeking animal who, therefore, is forever destined to compete for survival. However, if you stop for a moment and try to piece together what is actually happening today, you will discover a whole new vision of what the universe is doing and how we ought to change the way we think about the world at the very fundamental level. The national sovereignty is a very basic building block for the development of the language culture in which each and every individual will be able to cultivate his or her own innate creative impulses and to make discoveries of the principles of the universe. These fundamental discoveries are more urgently needed today than any other period in human history, because we are now facing a grave shift in the making of the universe. Our planet today is more susceptible to the near-Earth objects, such as asteroids and the meteoroids and other space debris, due primarily to the position of our solar system in our galaxy. This dynamic shift in our relationship to the universe plainly demands that we break from our old habit of believing in the mythical vision of the future, provided by a small number of elites and oligarchs in the world, if mankind is to survive. So, the pending question now is, what do we need to know today in order to play our righteous roles in our vehement universe?